looking at the substance of this law, right? She says it makes no sense to have sterilization, but it does make sense to have a draft during a time of war. And then she said, think of what goal you're serving, right? Remember, let me explain one more time. What interest is a draft serving versus what interest is a compulsory sterilization serving?
Well, like the sterilization, I guess, if we wanted like to kind of make up the human race and population, I guess, better.
Uh-huh.
And the drafting for war to
Ah, okay. So Irma's doing something that's very good. I want to just focus on this for a minute, okay? When I'm asking you about a deprivation of liberty without due process of law, I'm not just asking you, do you think reproductive functions are important, right? I'm not just asking you, do you think dying in war is bad? I'm really asking you two separate things, right? What is the government doing and what's their goal, right? What are they actually doing and what's their goal? You can call these things the means and the ends, okay? The means and the ends. This is a very common phrase that comes up in constitutional law. What are they doing, right? What are their steps they're taking? And what is their goal? That is, what is their end? And to assess whether something violates the due process of law, you have to figure out the fit between the means and the ends, right? You have to figure out what's the relationship between what they're doing and what they're trying to accomplish. That's called the fit. So, Ruth, are you next? Oh, no, she turned down the chat. Alexandra, I'll call on you. Ruth's like, no, go that way, go that way. So, Alexandra, let me ask you this question, please. So, when we talk about the draft, we'll do letter B first. Let's talk about the draft. Okay. The draft is basically a lottery. You think I was joking about the lottery last class, right? I'm not joking, right? It's a lottery, right? Everyone, all males are a certain age. Females are not subject to it. That might change. But all males are required to register when they turn 18. Remember the selective service? You filled out that little form. And in time of war, the government called a lottery. And they pick totally at random. Not much different than the story I told you guys last week, is it? And depending what war you're drafted for, it might be a death sentence, right? If they sent you to the front lines of Germany in the 1940s, you had a pretty good chance of dying. Sent you to Korea, you might not come back alive. They sent you to the trenches of France during World War I, you might not come back alive. So you have basically a completely random selection that could result in your death sentence. Completely random, right? I mean, whether you get drafted or not, there's not like, it's not, there are exceptions and people can get deferrals for health, whatever, but it's a pretty random process as a general matter. So, Alexandra, tell me, please, what is like the fit? What is the relationship between what the government's doing with the draft and what they're trying to accomplish? I know it's an awkward question, but I want you to talk it out. This is going to be important. What's like why are they doing this? Why are they choosing this approach? Oh, good point. So Alexandra, wouldn't it be better if they could just offer like incentives, like if you sign up for military service, we'll give you a really big bonus? Wouldn't that be like a less burdensome way to fill the ranks? But what's the problem with that?
Well, for me, an incentive wouldn't be enough.
No, you're not joining no matter what they're paying you, would you? No.
And I wouldn't care that much about, well, I do care about my life, obviously, but
Good.
What would matter to me?
I do also.
What would matter to me the most is that they're making me go and kill other people.
Oh, so you have conscientious problems with that as well. So it's not just your life is at risk. You'd be doing something that you would yourself find objectionable. So I think Alexandra raises a few good points, right? She says, certainly the government could try to offer monetary incentives, like cash prizes, if you will, to get people to join. Enlistment bonus, perhaps you call it. Maybe they offer tuition credits, right? You get a GI Bill to get free tuition. That's if you survive, right? But she raised the other point, if they don't have a compulsory draft, a mandatory draft, there might not be enough people to fight the wars. And you can imagine a circumstance where if we don't have enough people to fight on the fronts, our country can topple. Right? I mean, I picked World War II because there actually was an invasion on our west coast, and we had an entire fleet in the Pacific to fight the Japanese force. But the Japanese were intent on invading the United States. That was part of their mission. What was that? The Castle in the Sky. What's that show? Is it? Yeah, that's it. Man in the High Castle, which imagines if Germany had won the war. I mean, so it's not a hypothetical. I mean, if you don't have a draft, you don't have it. But there's a real deprivation of liberty at issue. Alexandra says, one, I might die, right? It's the ultimate deprivation of your life. You're going to be killed in the front. She says another one. She says, you're making me go and bear arms against and kill someone else, perhaps. And there's a conscientious violation. So there's a very serious deprivation of your liberty. But the ends of national security are really important. So you have to weigh these two, right? How big is the deprivation of liberty? And how significant is our security as a nation? And it's possible that you have a really big deprivation of liberty and you have a really big national security end. So the fit there works, right? You say, we are willing to satisfy, to justify that relationship because it's such an important interest, okay? This, what I'm doing right now with Irma, with Alexandra, is what's called scrutiny. Scrutiny, right? It's often called means-end scrutiny, where you have to assess what is the means that they're trying to use and what is the end they're trying to accomplish. And I use a very easy example like the draft because everyone can relate to it. But often these things are not so simple. So you would say, I think, for number 2 is, yes, it's a humongous deprivation of liberty, but there's no other way to preserve our national security. If you don't have this sort of regime, our country can topple. Maybe not. I don't know. Who knows? Yeah, Alex.
With the draft during Vietnam, where it was kind of questionable motives, and
I picked World War II on purpose. Yeah.
And so would that be held constitutional under Vietnam? Because I get World War II. That makes sense. Like there's just two evil powers, I guess, going against people. I guess even what if you were a Nazi in the U.S.? Maybe you agree with them. I don't know, but
You probably wound up in a camp.
yeah. But like for things like Vietnam or like in the Iraq War, there was
Right. So I'll mention this briefly, but there were challenges to the draft during World War I, and there were arguments that it violated the 13th Amendment, that the draft was a form of involuntary servitude, slavery. The courts turned those away. I don't know that those opinions are right, but they're not going anywhere. So the draft is settled. But my question is a little bit different. It's not about whether it's involuntary servitude. It's whether it's an adequate deprivation of your liberty. In Holmes' opinion in Buck... Okay, second date, I promise. In Holmes' opinion, Buck v. Bell, he makes his point. Hope you all notice it right now. He said, we send men off to war to die. Are you really telling me that we can't take the far lesser action of sterilizing someone for the benefit of society? Again, Holmes was shot twice in the Civil War. He managed to survive. Can you imagine him writing this opinion saying, wow, my buddies died at Gettysburg, right? At these bloody battles to save this republic. And you're telling me that was a valid justification of liberty, but not giving Miss Carrie Buck a procedure? That's what Holmes was getting at. This is why I'm raising this question this way, right? If the government can make you pay the ultimate sacrifice, that is giving your life in the battlefield, why is a lesser deprivation unjustified? But that's not the final answer, though. This is where the means and scrutiny comes into play. The mere fact that a sterilization procedure is less burdensome than dying in the battlefield, I think we would all probably agree with that, doesn't necessarily mean it's justified because of what is the goal they're trying to serve. The end with the draft is keeping our republic alive. Now, what is the ends, the goals of eugenics? Oh, you see where I'm going with this, right? To Holmes and to the Darwinists, keeping the bloodline pure was probably as important as defeating the Nazis. I don't say that lightly, but they believed. Let me show you some of this propaganda, right? They believed this. It was a very in vogue thought at the time. That there's just one cartoon I want to show you. Right? Eugenics is the way of the future. Is a self-directed human evolution. They thought that this was essential to the prosperity of the human race. So again, we're in the same spot. We are judging, courts are judging, is this a legitimate end of the government? Is eugenics a legitimate end? So you keep going back in this circle, right? Whenever you get into the realm of the substantive due process, courts are going to be assessing how big of a deprivation of liberty is this, the means, and is this a legitimate end, right? What are you trying to do with this? You can't escape it. Once you go beyond procedure to substance, courts have to make these decisions. And you might be okay saying, yeah, that's great. Buck v. Bell has to be wrongly decided. And I think it's wrongly decided. I have no problem saying that. But then you say, but how do you deal with the draft? And how do you deal with lots of other things which are far greater deprivations of liberty? Okay. Damon was patiently waiting. I think Denny has hand up also. Yes, sir.
My question is about the question itself.
Okay.
I understand the deprivation of the liberty, but I have a problem with without due process of law. Because in both of the sterilization and also regulatory draft, there are laws or that legislations have enacted. So,
Well, I'm sorry. I missed the last part of your question. You said legislation enacted. What legislation was enacted? I missed the last part of your question. I'm sorry.
So for the sterilization, there was a law
right.
that certain people should have been sterilized. So there was due process of law.
Oh, so let me stop you right there, Damon. Is your point that whenever the legislature passes a law, that means there's due process of law has been provided? Is that what your argument is?
Yes.
You're not alone, right? What you're saying, a lot of scholars actually think that. I think someone maybe mentioned this last class. So some scholars think that the fact that a law made it through the democratic process, right? Legislature, governor signs, whatever, right? That itself is what the due process requires. The response to that is that in some cases where the deprivation of liberty is so great, more process is due. That's not enough merely to enact the law. That the law has to have a substantive fairness. So what you're getting at is a procedural angle. The substantive angle perhaps exists, perhaps doesn't, which is why I phrased the question this way, a little bit deliberate. I spent some time, I changed it a few times. If you ever check the class notes the night before class, in the morning up, I usually tweak the question a little bit so you can see it in advance. Think about it if you want. I hope you think about it. It's good. But when you say the due process of law, it's saying what process is due. And perhaps where there's a really big deprivation of liberty, more process is due. If it's something trivial like, you have to put a stamp in an envelope to mail something, right? Passing the law is probably adequate. I don't know, pick something because people mail their taxes now. Denny, patiently withdraw.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question? I went on a little bit of Yeah, Trey, yes, sir.
How do you determine how much liberty deprived is too much?
Oh, yeah.
Is there a bright line or is there not a bright line?
No, my friend. No. That's the point I'm trying to convey to you. When you're asking a judge to decide what is the means, right? Is this deprivation of liberty? And what is the ends? There is no bright line. There's no fuzzy line. There's no line at all. A lot of this is going to be based on the judge's own sense of the world, which raises the important question, if this is so subjective, should courts even be in the business of deciding what is a liberty interest that's not enumerated? And is the deprivation of that liberty interest complying with the due process of law? There are some jurists, Robert Bork, I think is mentioned in your reading among others, who simply say, we judges should not be in this business. We don't know what liberty is. If the legislature decides that sterilizing Carrie Buck is a justified deprivation of her reproductive rights, then that's it. And I see the logic in that, because you can go from Buck v. Bell to abortion, same-sex marriage, whatever right you can think of. If a judge has free reign to decide what that right is, the democratic process is subverted. The flip side is, though, and this is a point I'll raise with Buck, she was not even given procedural due process, right? Her lawyer, as we'll find out, worked for the colony, right? It was a total sham. So even on the facts of Buck, which is an egregious case, it was wrongly decided. But the harder question is, could the courts have said, no, 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 you can't sterilize her because it deprives her of her liberty interest? Okay, what about the draft, right? There's not a good response. I raise this question to students every year. I think it was my final exam question one year. Maybe, write a dissent in Buck v. Bell. Yeah, you can attack Holmes all you want, but what's your rule? What rule do you lay down of why the state can't do this and other things can be done? It's harder than you think. It can be done. I'm telling you it can be done, but it's not as easy as you think. All right, so everyone okay with it? We'll talk about scrutiny a lot more, but I want just to get the sense of what are the means, what they're doing, and what are they trying to accomplish, and what's the relation between the two. Everyone okay with that? Oh, yes, sir, Jonathan.
Yep, under A, anybody born is equally likely. It's either 50-50, you're an imbecile or not, but under the drafting system, it's if you're a man, you're exponentially greater to be called an idiot, so it doesn't seem fair.
So which one do you think is a greater deprivation, Jonathan?
B.
The draft.
Because
if
I accept A, then everybody has an equal chance. You're born, it's 50-50, you're imbecile or not.
So the results from the class are actually a bit surprising. I thought it'd be closer. Most of you said that the sterilization is a greater deprivation of liberty than the draft. It's actually surprising. I'll get you guys in a second, I promise. So Jonathan says, with the draft, there's a very high chance you don't come home. But with the sterilization, you get your procedure, you come home. You can't reproduce, but you can still live a life. Yeah, Denny, and then Warren?
Well, my only issue here is that draft, we're presuming right now that you die.
There's a chance.
But there's a chance, right? Well, with the compulsory sterilization, it's 100% guaranteed your genetic line ends. So, while we can choose as individuals to have children or not, that's up to them. That's in your own choice, your own liberty to do. But when the state takes that away, I mean, that is akin to genetic death. So
as opposed to a high probability of physical death.
Yes. So it's still the same outcome. It doesn't matter.
Oh, okay. So you're taking a long-term picture, right? The bloodline, right? The details connect. No, sorry. Sorry, proper professor. Yeah, Warren.
I was just gonna respond to Jonathan was kind of alluding to the statistical issue that there was a 50-50 chance of being born an imbecile. I don't think that's exactly right. But
no, it's not.
There is a 50-50 chance of being born male versus female, and once you're, so you get that 50-50 chance that if you're born a male, then your odds of being drafted goes up. But if you get born to be a quote-unquote imbecile, then under that law, then there's only a 100% chance that you'll have no descendants, which seems to be a bigger.
Wow, so you're really big on the bloodline. I guess you're taking property. That's what you're thinking about now. Okay. All right. Anyone else on this point? We move on to Meyer. Yes, sir. Uh-huh.
Looking at your interest, looking at your mentioned scrutiny, for military service, the ends almost always are justified by the means, because without a country, what is the point of any of us being here? The country itself protects us from a multitude of things, and it doesn't grant us these rights, it just protects the rights that we have grown accustomed to. So if we don't have a country to kind of provide us with that security blanket, then nothing else matters, essentially.
So in the interest of national security, any deprivation of liberty is justified?
Not any deprivation, not any deprivation.
You knew I was going there.
I won't go that far.
But the draft is. The draft is.
The draft is.
Okay. Well, when we did case, Carlos, you want to add something, please?
Well, I was just going to add to him, it seems like the point he wants to get is what's the point of having laws if you're not going to have somewhere where to enforce them?
Yeah, this is Lincoln, right? Lincoln said to save the Constitution and lose the Republic is a pointless task. What's the point of having a Constitution if you have no country? Anyway, yeah, good point, Brian. Carlos, think of it. All right, let's go on. Yeah, actually, I'm surprised the results. I thought it'd be a little bit closer, but okay. I see where you guys are. But that, maybe you read Buck and you're very passionate about it. I don't know. Okay. All right. Who's next? Martin, I think you're up next. Martin, you want to read? Just give me the facts of Meyer v. Nebraska, please. Our first case off.
So Meyer was a professor at a private school, and he was teaching. He was teaching the students in German.
Yeah.
And so he ended up bringing a case against them for the data. They're not supposed to be teaching German until after 8th grade.
Yeah, Martin. Why did Nebraska? This is what 1923 or so. 1923, yeah. Why did Nebraska, you think, ban? And actually, this is a criminal statute. Just to be clear, they were throwing this teacher in jail, right? It was a criminal case. Meyer versus the people of Nebraska, the state of Nebraska. Martin, why was Nebraska going around banning the teaching of these languages in primary schools? Yep. Yeah, and then what particularly about German do you think was, thought about in the 1920s and the late 1910s? What was going on in the world then? Yeah, there was a pretty big war. Yeah, I'll let you all think. Yeah, you're good, Martin. Thank you. Yeah, this was a response to World War I, right? And there was a very anti-Germanic bias in the United States. For example, sauerkraut was called Liberty cabbage, right? My worst, I have a dachshund at home. They would actually kill dachshunds because they were a German dog. I know. When we talk about animals, we get really sad, right? It was a very strong, and one of the aspects, and Holmes alludes to this in his opinion, is having a single tongue, right? And punishing people who want to speak German, right? The law didn't criminalize all languages. It only criminalized, it didn't prohibit what are called ancient or the dead languages, like Greek or Latin or Hebrew. So if you were studying Latin in a boarding school, you were fine. But if you were speaking German, French, Italian, Spanish maybe, it was a crime. So you've all heard of the Scopes monkey trial, right, where the guy was thrown in jail for teaching evolution. You probably heard of that. You never heard this case, did you? This is a far more important case than Scopes monkey. It just doesn't serve the same narrative, right? So this went to the Supreme Court. And David, what did Justice McReynolds do with this conviction for Mr. Meyer?
He said it was incorrect because he said mere knowledge of the German language cannot be regarded as harmful.
Okay, so David, let me ask the question a little bit more precisely. Why was this statute, why was this prosecution unconstitutional? What did it do that was bad? Well, let me ask the question a little more precisely. What constitutional provision did this law run afoul of? 14. More precisely? Okay, so it ran afoul of the Due Process Clause. Okay, good. So Shivani, why did Justice McReynolds conclude that this prosecution violates the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause? Whose liberty? Who's there? Just the parents? And? Oh, you got all three. Very good. This is a very important case because it affects liberty of three different parties, right? Right? So first of all, the teacher was in jail, right? So there was a deprivation of the teacher's liberty. He was being thrown in jail for practicing a lawful occupation, and as David said, there's nothing harmful about teaching German. It also deprives the liberty interest of the parents, right? That parents can direct the education of their children within certain bounds, and they can decide what language they're studying at school. But it also affects the liberty of the children. And we don't talk much about kids here, right? We don't talk much about the rights of students, especially students in school. We had these massive protests last week, these walkouts, right? As a general rule, students do not surrender their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gates. They can't disrupt class. That's a given. It can't cause a substantial disruption. But they do have First Amendment rights. But this case is not about the First Amendment. Okay? It's not mentioned anywhere in the opinion. Think back to Harlan last week in the Burlington Railroad case, right? He didn't mention the Fifth Amendment takings clause. Ditto here. The First Amendment rights of free speech, religion, not even mentioned. So then the question becomes, right, Damon, how does Justice McReynolds know that the liberty interests protected by the 14th Amendment include education, include parents directing the children to learn a language or not? How does McReynolds know that the 14th Amendment protects the right of a teacher to engage in teaching German? How does he know that, Damon? That's the tough question. How does McReynolds know this? I see you struggling. Or tell me, well, what does he say these liberty interests are? Does he give us a definition? Well, yeah, that's that question, maybe a little differently. I'll come back to my first question in a minute, but let's try this one first.
He says that these are religious purposes. The right to teach, the right to appraise their children, and the right, and the students have the right to learn. So, and he says, while this is a legitimate purpose, the means adopted here is overbroad and not closely related to the achievement of this purpose.
Oh, okay. So Damon said a few things that are very good, right? McReynolds adopts this means ends fit, right? That I just told you about 5 minutes ago, right? So what is the state trying to do here? They're trying to have children speak English, right? Their goal is to have kids speak English, right? That's their goal, right? That's what they want to accomplish. But what are the means they're using to get there? Throwing teachers in jail for teaching foreign languages. Everyone see this, right? Let me write this out because I think Damon framed the issue quite well, right? So what is the means here? What is the end? The end is population speaks English, right? That's what they're trying to accomplish. How do they get there, right? Criminalizing teaching of foreign languages in primary school. Those are your means, and that's your ends. And again, this deprives the liberty of the teacher, the parent, and the students, right? It's all three. So Kevin, let me ask you this question, please. How would you describe the fit between the means and the ends here, right? Is there a good fit, a good relationship?
No.
Why not? Tell me why.
Well, I mean, if your goal is to promote the English language, then punishing people who are in the best position to teach that language doesn't really make sense. I mean, you can promote English language and not prison teachers.
What other way could you do to promote English speaking population?
You have it as required course.
Yes, right? So what McReynolds is saying here, I think Damon and Kevin make the point, the statute's too broad. If what you want to have is a population that speaks English, mandate teaching of English. Don't throw in jail teachers of German. The fit is not good. If you imagine, you can have a suit, right? A custom tailored suit, right? If you ever go to Hong Kong, they're really cheap. I have a couple of them. They're really good, right? They make them in 3 days. They're fantastic, right? If you have a custom tailored suit, it fits you perfectly. It fits like a glove, right? It suits you. That's called a suit, right? It suits you perfectly. But then you go like to Kmart, whatever, right? Or Kmart exists, whatever. And you got like one of these, like, you know, a burlap bag suit that doesn't really fit you. It's kind of hanging off you. Looks like, you know, doesn't look very good. When you're talking about the deprivation of liberty, an important right, you need the custom tailored suit. You can't just throw in a burlap bag. You can't just have this broad solution that can maybe accomplish speaking English. It probably does at the margin help, but it's too broad, right? This is what we would generally call something like a strict scrutiny, right? Where you need a very narrow tailoring. It has to be tailored to fit your body very carefully. You can't just have this broad thing, oh yeah, let's just throw the teachers in jail, when you could probably do this in a less burdensome fashion. Everyone understand what Kevin and Damon just said? It's a very good point they both made. Okay? So this is scrutiny. Yes, Abdul.
Can I comment on this case?
Of course you can.
I'm having a hard time.
Yeah, of course you can.
Okay, so I'm fluent in Arabic,
okay,
as well as English, and a bit of Spanish. And I feel really bad. I wish I could go back and being younger and learn another 2 or 3 languages. I'm hoping to teach my kids 4 or 5. And the only half-assed argument that they put
half-assed. Okay, I like that one. Yeah.
On the other side is national interest, nationalism. But it's completely false, right? Because we won't have good business relations with India and China. Europe and Russia won't be involved in politics and religion, Iran and so on. We don't understand those cultures, those languages, those religions at all. So even though I don't believe in this idea of like clash of civilizations, well, let's say it is true. We have to compete with everybody. We're at a disadvantage, not an advantage, by not learning their languages.
So you're saying that the end itself is not legitimate. You're not even just challenging the means. You're challenging the end. You're saying that we should not just have an English-only speaking population.
Yeah. If the actual end, so that's the end. They're saying it's about language, but I'm saying the actual end, subliminally, it's national interest, nationalism.
Okay, so Abdul raises a good point, right? He raises a very good point. There are 2 elements, right? There are 2 elements here. Are courts assessing the validity of the means and the validity of the ends? Right, Kevin says it's insane throwing teachers in jail. They're the ones who can teach English also. Why are you throwing them in jail? Abdul says, no. Not only the means half-assed, I think you said, right? The ends are the ends are half-assed. I'm getting in trouble, right? The ends are half-assed because the government shouldn't have this sort of nationalistic interest. They should be interested in having a diverse polity.
I was even saying that even if that is our goal, is the U.S. needs to be supreme over every other country, however you want to
You accomplish that through multiple languages. Exactly. There it is. Okay. So he's probably right? He has a full... No, that's not there, right? He's probably right on this one. What enables courts to even engage in this second guessing of the legislature is substantive due process. Because otherwise, say, well, the people from Nebraska thought one thing, Justice Abdul thinks a second thing. Why is Justice Abdul more important than the entire Nebraska legislature? By the way, Nebraska has a unicameral legislature. They have 1 house. It's the only state in the union. They have 1 house and a governor. So I've been to the state house. It's very big, but for a small government. Okay. But there's a threshold question, which I was getting with Damon. He took me on a detour, which is fine. Taylor, I'm going to ask you his question now. How does Justice McReynolds know that the 14th Amendment's reference to liberty includes teaching? How does he know this?
Well, he said that liberty hasn't been defined exactly.
Oh, good.
It's received much consideration, and some things have been definitely included.
Okay.
And then
Yeah, give me the list. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Thank you, Taylor. Give me a list, please.
the whole list. Yeah.
Please read it. Thank you.
It says it denotes not merely freedom from bodily restraint, but also the right of the individual to contract, to engage in any of the common occupations of life, to acquire useful knowledge, to marry, establish a home and bring up children, to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience, and generally to enjoy those privileges long recognized as common law as essential to the orderly pursuit of happiness by freedom.
Well read. Thank you. He gives this long list of rights and liberties protected by the 14th Amendment. And I think Taylor made the point, well, he says, well, it's not really clear, but at a minimum, these things are included. So my question for you, Amber, is where does he get this list from? If you notice there's not a citation there, he's not referencing the text of the Constitution. He mentions religion and stuff, but doesn't mention the First Amendment. Amber, where on earth is Justice McReynolds getting this from?
He does get it from just a lot of different cases combined, I guess, like Slaughterhouse and Yicklo and Lochner.
How is a judge, Amber, to decide to make this list? It's like a menu, right? You go to a restaurant, you have a menu of things you can order. Here, the judge is making a menu of various liberty interests that courts will protect. Where does this come from, Amber? How is McReynolds supposed to know this? How does McReynolds have a better sense of what liberty is than the Nebraska legislature? Why is a justice any more qualified to make that call than a state government?
He also references the list includes like a section of the Civil Rights Act.
Ah, so the Civil Rights Act we've talked about, right? That includes rights of contract. Does that include teaching? Was that? I don't think that was in the act, was it?
But I think there's a part that says there's a right to pursue an occupation, and so this is kind of taking away their or restricting their occupation.
And does that necessarily protect a student's right to learn? I'm messing with you on purpose, but you're actually giving very good answers.
No, well, yes, I think so. I think in long term it would affect a student. A student's right to learn would affect their right to an occupation in long term if you were trying to play it
Okay,
out.
so you see what I'm doing with Amber, right? I'm doing this very deliberately. McReynolds more or less makes this list up based on historical practice, the Civil Rights Act of '66, which Amber mentioned a minute ago, various cases. He's doing here the same thing that Justice Harlan did in the Burlington Railroad case, right? He didn't say that the takings clause applies to the states. We said having compensation for a taking is so important, so fundamental, that you can't have a civilized society without it. What McReynolds is saying here is that these rights of contract, engaging in occupations, raising a family, worshiping God, have been long recognized at common law as essential to the orderly pursuit of happiness by free man. By the way, and this is a question for anyone, why is marriage essential for the orderly pursuit of happiness? We'll come back to this one later. Anyone want to raise your hand? Why is marriage? People will cite this for propositions. Trey, you're laughing. Oh, why not? Fine. Someone else. We'll come back to this quote later when we do the same-sex marriage cases, but why do you think McReynolds said that marriage was essential to the orderly pursuit of mankind? Yeah, Warren?
Well, because I think they're going under the assumption that if you're a moral person, you're not going to have sex before marriage.
And what usually results from sex, Warren?
Happiness.
Yeah. And what comes 9 months later?
That was your words about, like, why is there
And what comes 9 months later after that bliss?
Also the extreme, if you don't have kids, you'll believe the extreme happiness of having your children around.
Okay, yeah. His answer was to be children. That was the answer to the question. But at the time, the idea was if you're going to have children, you have it through marriage. You have kids through marriage. So what he's saying there is you need to have marriage to have responsible family raising. That's what he's getting at. This is going to be cited in a very different fashion decades later, but I wanted, Trey, you were laughing way too hard on that one. You're covering your mouth.
In moral theology, marriage is for the relief of concupiscence, which is...
It's for the relief of...
Concupiscence.
You're going to have to define that.
Yeah, right? You can't... If the church teaches that sex outside of the marriage is sin, so in order to relieve lust, you get married, and therefore you can have sex. Hopefully the procreation of children. But it's exactly what my colleague referred to.
Thank you, sir. Well, we got that straightened out, right? Anyway, but McReynolds is basically making this list. One brief note of McReynolds. He was a bizarre dude. He is not well liked. He was a rabid anti-Semite. So much so that when Justice Brandeis, who was the first Jewish justice from the court, he wouldn't even look at Brandeis. When Brandeis would start talking, he would turn his chair around. And the year when they all take their group photo, that Brandeis was supposed to stand next to McReynolds wouldn't even go to the room to sit next to him. Wouldn't even do it. Fascinating guy. He went to the University of Virginia Law School. You will not see a single portrait of him anywhere. They basically just own the guy. They will not talk about him. But this is one of his more famous opinions. McReynolds became one of the four so-called horsemen of the New Deal, and that he voted to invalidate many aspects of the New Deal legislation. It was McReynolds, Sutherland, Butler, and Van Devanter. These were the four guys who were always dissent. And a funny story, McReynolds was considering retiring at the time when Roosevelt came into office. But the Congress basically changed the pension system, which made it harder for him to retire. It's like, okay, I'm going to stay on the court. And then he was a thorn in Roosevelt's side. So they could have gotten rid of him, but they tried to screw him on the pension. All right. any then questions on Myers, right? The holding, right, is that you have this liberty interest, and that this law does not justify the means are not justified by the ends, right? This is where the expression comes from, right? You can't, having English is a good interest, but the means is too broad. Okay. Any questions on the majority? All right. You have in your book, who's next? Sophia, you have in the book The Holmes Dissent. I think we're the only book in the country that has dissent. Most people don't even know it exists, but it does. It was in another case, I think it was from Ohio, or I'm sorry, Iowa, where the law was slightly different. But Sophia, what's Holmes' point here? Right? Why is Holmes dissenting from this issue?
So he disagrees with the majority in saying that the end purpose of the law is comfort, because it's desirable.
And does that justify throwing the teacher in jail?
Yes.
Why?
Because I guess he refers to the fact that like young children are often only hear Polish or French or German spoken, so it would be reasonable and necessary for it to be accomplished.
Okay, very good. And I want to draw your attention to the very end of Holmes' opinion. He says, "This appears to me to be a question upon which men reasonably might differ. It appears to be a question upon which men might reasonably differ. And therefore I am unable to say that the Constitution prevents the experiments being tried." This is his Lochner dissent. Right? This is his dissent in Lochner. If reasonable people could disagree on whether this is a good or bad policy, that means the courts have no role in stopping it. Right? This is Damon's point a little bit earlier, right? If this made it through the Nebraska legislature, that's all the process that's due. There was a vote, it was held, the governor didn't veto it, that's it for the courts. So Holmes basically sees no latitude, almost zero latitude for the courts to intervene on this front. All right. Any questions on Meyer v. Nebraska or the Holmes dissent? Yeah, the Holmes dissent's good. Most people just don't. I only learned about it about 2 or 3 years ago. No one even knew it was there because it was in a different case. Yeah.
Is it likely that if World War I had not occurred, that the states might have found a different solution? Do you think?
It's a hard counterfactual because if World War I didn't happen, they wouldn't have banned teaching German. Right. So I'm not sure if I can do the counterfactual. Yeah, Warren, what's your hand up? I thought I saw a hand. Yeah, Brian. Yes. Well. What Holmes is saying is we don't get to judge the tailoring because this is purely a matter of the democratic process. He wasn't even willing to check if it's narrowly tailored. He's fine with the burlap bag.
But even in the act, he says that it's only limited to areas in which English isn't the only language that can be spoken at home.
Right. Yeah, he thinks that this is a reasonable way of accomplishing this end goal. He's not going to judge how precise it fits. Okay? All right, let's do the next case, Pierce. This was a follow-up case that came, 2 years later, 1925, also by Justice McReynolds. Trey, you want to talk about this case? Okay, I'll pass. So the reason why I don't mean to pick on my good friend Trey. Today in society, it's not well known how rabid anti-Catholicism was in the early 20th century. It just doesn't. We don't have that legacy today. Even when President Kennedy, who was a Catholic, was elected and president in the 1960s, there was a very strong sentiment that he was an agent of the Pope, right? That he would just be like Trump and Putin, right? That he'd be an agent of the Vatican, right? That he would just do whatever the Vatican said. It's the same thing. Nothing ever changes. Yeah. There's always the Manchurian candidate, right? Nothing ever changes. Nothing ever changes, ever. Every year I teach things say the same. So there was a very strong anti-Catholic sentiment. And in the late 1800s, a lot of states changed their constitutions, what were called Blaine Amendments. B-L-A-N-E, Blaine Amendments. And these were named after Senator Blaine, I think it's from Maine. And these amendments said that the state can't spend any money on religious programs. You say, wow, Josh, isn't that great? Establishment Clause, right? Separation of church and state. No. Okay. These laws were not designed to separate church and state. They were designed to make sure that Catholic schools were starved. It was specifically to prevent funding of Catholic schools. There wasn't much private schools back then that were religious, except for Catholic schools. That was a very prominent institution. So a lot of states had these amendments that banned funding of Catholic schools. Okay. Fast forward to the early 1920s, and another type of law was enacted. Were called compulsory education acts. These laws, like the one in Oregon, were designed to force students of a certain age to go to a public school. And you might think, Josh, isn't this great, right? Students in public school, everyone should be learning on the public school education. This law was backed by the Ku Klux Klan and other nationalists. This was primarily a way of shutting down Catholic schools. It affected private schools also. There was the Hill Military Academy, but this was primarily designed to shut down Catholic schools and force children to become American? I don't know, whatever words you want to use, right? But it's the same idea as the German, right? To make them funnel into a single educational system where the state could control what they learn. Okay? So again, this law was not about ensuring that private schools provide a certain curriculum, right? That's not what was at issue here. What was at issue is it became a crime to send your kid to public school. It was a crime. So what happened? As a result of this law, various private schools brought lawsuits saying, look, we're going to lose all of our customers. If it's a crime to send your kid to a Catholic school, we're going to go out of business. Okay? So there was a challenge. Okay, let me make one point briefly. You'll often hear in the news that corporations don't have constitutional rights, all this stuff. The Society of Sisters was a group of nuns, right? They were a corporation. The Hill Military Academy was a corporation. There's not any doubt in this opinion that these corporations have constitutional rights. It's not even doubted for a second. Not even for a split second, it doesn't even come up. So this notion that corporations have no rights is it's a good talking point, but it doesn't have any legs in history. Now, that's not to say that campaign finance laws can't be upheld, but the basic premise doesn't work. All right. So we have the Society of Sisters as an Oregon corporation, and they bring this lawsuit. Okay, Laura, what does the court here hold here? Again, this is McReynolds 2 years after Myers. How does the court resolve this one?
They said that in enforcing that statute, it would destroy its profits of the business and diminish their value of their property.
Very good. So this case says there's basically a deprivation of a liberty interest. Not of just the parents, but also of the schools to run their business, right? Again, this is not a First Amendment case on religion or speech. It's a case premised on property rights, as Laura said. A case premised on the right to earn an honest living, vocational rights. And the court finds that this law is completely irrational. And again, I don't think Holmes dissented here. Maybe he couldn't even go along with this, right? Shutting down all the private schools in a state. So there wasn't much new between Meyer and Pierce, but these are both important decisions concerning the scope of the 14th Amendment. I don't have too much more to add on that one. Any other questions on Pierce or Myers? Any questions on Pierce or Myers? We'll come back to these cases later. Just make sure you put this in your notes. In the 1960s, there was an effort to redefine Pierce and Myers as First Amendment cases. You do a case, I think next week, called Griswold versus Connecticut, involving birth control. And Justice Douglas says, aha, Myers and Pierce were cases about the freedom of speech and First Amendment. No, they were not. Not even mentioned. These were Lochner-style substantive due process cases, and that's the only way you can read them. The court would later recharacterize them, but it's simply revisionism, as it were. Okay, any other questions on Pierce and Myers? All right, let's go into the next case, which I already teased earlier. Buck v. Bell. This is probably one of the hardest cases of the year to teach, because the facts are so egregious, and the actual facts, not the facts in the case, but the actual circumstances are even worse. And the notes help give you a flavor that Justice Holmes wrote this opinion in the manner in which he did quite deliberately. It's only, what, a page and a half long, 2 pages long? It's really short, right? But he wrote this because he firmly believed in it. You can't fake this, right? If you write this and you're like uneasy about it, you can, couch it a little bit, make it a little bit softer, but he firmly believed this. So let me walk you through some of the history here, which will help put this into context for you. The sterilization law was enacted here in 1924. Please put this in your notes. In the same act, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act. The Racial Integrity Act of 1924. This law made it a crime to marry someone of the opposite race. Right? In the same act
that Virginia provided for sterilization, Virginia also criminalized
interracial marriage. It's called miscegenation. Miscegenation. This was part of a concerted effort of basically white supremacy and racial supremacy and genetic supremacy, all bundled together in a single bill. They were trying to make the race and the bloodline more pure. It's often thought that eugenics began in Nazi Germany, which is simply false. It began in the United States. The Nazis took it to the next level, perhaps, but it was really an American invention. And it's hard to explain this point, but eugenics was so well accepted that if you were to go to Harvard or Yale or these big universities, you'd have departments on eugenics, professors teaching classes on this, same way I'm teaching you all, professors writing books and papers on this, right? This was considered science that had to be implemented. So when I asked, I think someone earlier, I think it was Alexandra, was eugenics a legitimate end? You guys can sit here today and say, of course not, this is freaking insane, right? This is nuts. But back then, and if the leading professors and the leading intellectuals and presidents of the United States said, this is the future of a republic, it's not so easy to say this is nuts, right? This was what makes the Holmes opinion so hard to read, basically 90-something years later. So this is Kevin, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to kind of reference that real quick. So in the majority opinion in Meyer's, Reynolds referenced Plato's Republic. So is that something Holmes then would agree with, like state control over
Probably.
life?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Oh, I forgot. Today at 1 o'clock, the Federal Society is holding an event on Justice Scalia. Ed Whalen, a former clerk of Scalia, is coming to talk about a new book. This book is awesome. I have a copy. Justice Scalia gave hundreds of speeches in his life, and this book compiles them. Is it in Emily Sloan? I think it's 6 4. So at 1 o'clock, grab this. Go get some free food. But he's a good friend of mine. You'll enjoy the talk. Okay, back to your mind makes your question. Okay, so yeah, Holmes I think would believe in state control of everyone. Sparta, the entire thing, right? So this is Carrie Buck, and these facts are not pleasant. Carrie Buck was designated feeble-minded. Why was she designated feeble-minded? Because she was promiscuous. One of the misconceptions about this case is that imbecile or feeble-minded meant we might call today mental retardation or mentally handicapped. It also included immorality. So she was deemed promiscuous. Why was she promiscuous? Because she got married outside of wedlock, right? She got married when she wasn't, she got pregnant outside of marriage. That didn't make sense. She got pregnant when she wasn't married. Okay. How did she get pregnant? She was raped. And it gets worse. Carrie's mother wasn't able to care for her, so she left her off with some godparents. And I think it was her uncle, basically, who raped her. So she was living with her uncle. He raped her. She gets pregnant. He says, oh crap. He turns her over to the home and says she's a promiscuous imbecile. That's exactly what happened. Yeah, the facts here are not easy to come by. This is Carrie Buck with her mother, Emma Buck. This is Dr. Bell, who was the superintendent for the state colony for epileptics. Now, you think of epilepsy, right? You know, people who have these seizures, whatever. Epileptics was a fairly broad term back then that referred to generally people who were deemed imbeciles. If you want to read more, there's a book by that name called Imbeciles. A guy named Cohen wrote it. It's not an easy read, but it's a very good book. Came out about a year or two ago. This is the colony courthouse where she was, where her case was first heard. And this is the state colony where she was sterilized. I want to show you this family tree. Perhaps the most famous line in Buck v. Bell, most famous line, which I'm sure you all read, like, what the hell is he talking about? 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Most people read that and think, wow, that's just rhetoric, right? But he was actually making a scientific judgment. Carrie Buck was a test case. The Virginia government passed a statute in 24, and they wanted to determine its validity in the courts. Other state courts in other states had invalidated eugenics laws, so they were nervous. They said, we need to take this case up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So Virginia selected Carrie Buck as patient zero, so to speak. And why did they pick Carrie Buck? Because they wanted to make the case that imbecility was hereditary, that it passed down the bloodline. So they said, we need someone whose mother was an imbecile, who she was an imbecile, and her daughter was an imbecile. This is an actual family tree made by the doctors in her case. And it says, immediate blood kin of Carrie Buck showing illegitimacy and hereditary feeble-mindedness. And you'll notice there's generation number 1, generation number 2, generation number 3. And there's a little hand pointing here, right? So that's Carrie. That's Carrie Buck, right? Carrie's mom was Emma. Question mark for the father, right? Just, to rub it in, right? But the mother was Emma. Vivian is the daughter of Carrie Buck. That was the child she was raped by her uncle. Okay? There's a little legend here, right? F is feeble-minded. Question mark means unknown. And dotted line says illegitimate mating. That is outside wedlock. Or out of wedlock, I should say. If you notice, there's an F in Emma's circle. There's an F in Carrie Buck's circle. And there's an F in Vivian's circle. What they were showing with this plot is that there were 3 generations of feeble-minded individuals in the same maternal bloodline. This is the evidence that they were presenting to the court to prove why eugenics sterilization was essential to prevent a 4th generation. By the way, Carrie had a kid, so that bloodline had already spread. Okay? Now, I already mentioned, why was Carrie deemed an imbecile? She got raped, got pregnant. Why was her mother deemed an imbecile? I think she had some sort of STD, it might have been syphilis or gonorrhea or something. It happens, right? Why was Vivian an imbecile? This one is the most bizarre. I think I have a picture of her somewhere. So a picture of Vivian, I think it's in the book. Oh, here it is. So at the time, Vivian was an infant, maybe less than a year old. And the doctors administered an IQ test to the baby. Wait, what? I'm not making this up. Go read this book, Imbecile. They took a coin and they put it in front of the baby's face and they kind of made it shine on her. And they said, she didn't react to the coin, therefore she's feeble-minded. This was science, right? Hashtag I love science. I'm omitting a word. I effing love science, right? This was science back then. I'm always skeptical of stuff, right? This was hashtag science, right? Bill Nye would have been all over this stuff back then, right? Yeah, I went there. I used to love that show. Anyway, this was science. So because you had 3 generations of imbecility, the government said we need to remove this bloodline from the world. And we need to sterilize Carrie Buck. As it turns out, none of them were idiots. Carrie Buck went, I think, through, I don't think she graduated high school. She went to high school. She could read, she could write. One of the ironies is, one of the pieces of evidence is that she apparently wrote flirty letters to a classmate. And that was evidence of her imbecility, that she could write a letter that was like flirtatious with a classmate, you know, before texting to write letters, as people would do back then. I actually found a copy of Vivian's report card. This was somewhere. I can't remember where the hell I find it. And she got A's and B's. You know, I mean, decent student, right? She died at the age of 8 of some sort of intestinal disease. But this was the evidence, right? None of this was put into court. And it gets worse. A lawyer was appointed for Carrie Buck. The lawyer was a former member of the board of the colony. Her lawyer worked for the group trying to sterilize her. So we can talk about procedural due process. The procedure was a sham. He put on no witnesses. He put in no evidence of the record. He basically made no real arguments. His entire purpose was just to move the case along so it can go up on appeal. He basically worked with the other side to develop the legal strategy. Right? It was a total sham. So it gets worse. It's not even clear if Carrie Buck knew what was going on. It's not clear. I read some stories where apparently they would tell women, oh, you have some problems on your hips, right? You need to release some pressure on your hips, right? And then they do the procedure. So she probably figured out at some point what was going on, but it's not exactly known what she knew and when she knew it. So she had her trial right in front of a judge. It was a total sham. There was no evidence put in. She had no defense. Went up to the court and went to the Supreme Court. Then it gets to Justice Holmes. And Justice Holmes writes this fairly brief opinion. It's only about, 5 or 6 paragraphs, whatever it was. And it blesses this procedure. And in fact, he seems very excited about it, right? He seems very vigorous about that. This is something that's very important. And you have to see this in the background of what was going on in the world. Everyone's heard of the Malthusians, right? Thomas Malthus, who was afraid that the world would run out of food. There was a fear of overpopulation, and we run out of food. We need to control the gene pool, right? And we need to stop this. And it was a piece of propaganda. The Nazis carried it almost all the way. But this was an American invention. But I want to now actually focus on the legal arguments, because there are legal principles here. God, who's next? I forgot. I got so distracted. Yeah, Chaz. Chaz, let me ask you a question. If the state determines that someone is an imbecile, can they lock them up in a home for the rest of their lives? Commitment, you might call it today. Institutionalization.
Like morally, or I mean,
today, 2018, if someone is a danger to themselves or others, can they be locked up indefinitely in a home?
And yes.
Yeah, they can. All right, so let's say that a person can be let out, right? Better to be let out or be kept in?
For them or for
anyone? for the person, right?
I mean, for the better society, possibly not, but for them, yes.
Okay, so Chaz, let me ask you this third question, which you probably didn't see coming. If indeed the problem is that these people are reproducing, there are 2 ways of solving the problem, right? You can keep them in a home forever, sex-segregated units, or you can sterilize them and let them free for the rest of their lives. Which is better? Oh, Yvonne, you're next, you know it. Well, actually, Mina is next, but I see you reacting. But that's the question, right? If they can lock you up forever, or they can sterilize and let you go, which is a lesser infringement on their liberty? It's like my question speaking of class, isn't it? Yeah, that's why I asked it. No, Chaz, Yvonne, you can go next. I see you're good to answer. Yeah, go ahead, Chaz.
I would say that it's better to let them go, sterilize them, and let them go. It's like picking up that stuff.
Yeah, black with these questions, right? Yvonne, you seem want to weigh in. Go ahead.
Well, let me just preface this with, when I read this case, I literally stopped reading for about 2 hours just to bring it all in. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And so your question is on point. Which one is better is the question.
No, that's not. I mean, but look, I'm not mad at you, but that's the question, right? I'm sorry?
Letting him free.
You think letting him free without reproductive rights, without the yeah. So this is actually Holmes's point, though, and I'm not making this bluntly because I want you. There's a legal argument here beneath all the all this awful rhetoric, right? Holmes's point is this: if the state has the power to lock these imbeciles up the rest of their lives at public expense, it's not cheap. Wouldn't it be a lesser deprivation of liberty to sterilize them so that they can be free and live amongst everyone else? In fact, Carrie Buck, after she was sterilized, was let out. I think she had 2 husbands. She got married twice. No children, obviously, right? Mina, what do you think here? I mean, I'm giving you a really hard question. I don't pretend to have an answer for you, but is Holmes necessarily wrong about this? That if the state has the greater power to confine someone for life, why shouldn't it be upgrade, right? It's better to just sterilize and let them leave.
I want to answer this, with constitutional law in the context, but I can't help but feel very biased. This just seems morally wrong, just wrong in all senses. So you're asking whether Buck should have been retained in the institution?
Yeah, that's the alternative. If the state says she's dangerous, we let her out, she'll start having all these kids and corrupting her bloodline, right? That's the argument. So why? I mean, Mina, let me ask the question differently. Would you be okay with the state locking Carrie Buck up for the rest of her life in a sex-segregated unit where she has no access to men?
No.
But could the state do that if they wanted to?
Yes.
They could.
Just impose upon themselves to decide. They made the decision for them.
Well, who would ever voluntarily submit to that, though?
True, I guess. Okay, I retract that.
That's okay.
I just don't agree with the decision.
Oh, I know, Arlene. I don't pretend.
It's really difficult.
I know this is a hard case. I'm more interested in getting your thoughts, Arlene. So let me ask this question, right? If the state has the far greater power of confining a person for the rest of her life, and I think everyone agrees they probably could do that, why is this lesser deprivation of liberty, which is the draft question, it's in a different form, right?
One thing I'm thinking about, if she's locked up, she's not only locked up, but she also has no chance to reproduce anyway, because she's locked up.
Oh, you say it's the same no matter what, she's in the same spot.
Yeah, and then he also compared it to, I think it was a vaccination.
Yes. Oh, good. Yeah. Stephanie, let me ask about the vaccination. I was going to get to that point in a minute. There was a case decided called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. Jacobson versus, very important case. We don't talk about much. And this involved the smallpox vaccination. And the state of Massachusetts wanted to mandate people got not good for smallpox. Now, this is not like Jenny McCarthy vaxxer stuff, right? Back then, vaccines were actually quite dangerous. You could die by getting a vaccine. And Stephanie, the government said, we're going to make you take this injection in your arm, whatever it happens to be. If they can make someone take an injection to their arm to promote the public good, and that injection might kill them, why can't they take a fairly routine procedure that has a very low chance of fatality? What the greater and the lesser, if they can do this much bigger thing, why can't they do this less thing? What's the answer there?
Result of folks not getting vaccinated would be a danger to literally so many people.
Yeah.
Whereas, someone imbecile, I didn't understand why they were. I mean, I guess the reason that they were danger to society and public good is because they were judging morals or something. I don't know.
Well, but Stephanie, let me respond to you like this. According to these hashtag science people back then in the 1920s, this family tree blows up thousands of rows, right? By letting every imbecile you let reproduce can spawn 15 children. Did anyone ever see the movie Idiocracy? Yeah. So I'm not going to talk about it, but just Google the trailer later. You'll see what I'm talking about, right? But I should bring the clip for next year. But yeah, I mean, is that not a compelling interest to prevent the destruction of our gene pool if we can stop this? Is this any different than a smallpox outbreak? Yeah, I think a couple of you made a similar point that I'll get you guys in a second, Hannah and Lauren. I'll get you guys in a second. But once you veer into the realm of substantive due process, legal arguments start disappearing very quickly. I think you guys are all more or less in agreement. There's not much law. So the first half of the semester I was talking about, here's this clause, and here's this clause. I don't talk about clauses anymore. It doesn't really matter. Once you get into this second half of the semester, clauses don't have much weight, which, to reiterate the question, should judges even be in this realm? You say, of course not. Then you say, what about Holmes? Holmes was in that realm. Holmes is like, yeah, whatever you guys want, go do it. Have fun. So if you're opposed to all substantive due process, then Holmes has to be right. But if you think you need substantive due process, what is your line? Hannah, and then Warren, and then Abdul.
I think that was kind of my point. We were talking a lot about the means, but we didn't really talk about the end. Why can't the court decide that there's not any appropriate means to the end, because the end is unnecessary? But I guess that's
But it's the same. It's the same. It's a value judgment on saying that trying to cleanse the gene pool is inappropriate. Who are you to say that hashtag science is wrong, right? Who are you as the judge?
what? I mean, not that it matters, but personally, I think that that's a the legislator anyway.
And the legislature decided this is really important. I think, 30-something states had these sorts of laws in the books? Right. This stuff went on to the 1950s and 60s. It was a case. This still happens in prison, where people are given the option of you can stay in prison or we can sterilize you and let you out. This today, 2018, I read about a case about this maybe a few weeks ago. This still goes on. I think Warren, then Abdul?
Yeah, if you have to, have the assumption that of believing that them reproducing would be a danger to society, I was going to mention what you actually just mentioned first, is that maybe the lesser infringement on liberty is to give that person the choice of being sterilized or incarcerated, which, like you said before, does not equate to much of a choice. But of course, you can say that it's hindsight to say that you can choose incarceration and wait for the legislature, their public opinion, to change again and strike down that law. But it may not be just hindsight, because you said that the laws like that were being struck down in other states.
State courts. But once the Supreme Court ruled, that was it. Turned the tide. One note briefly. We always talk about punishment, right? Cruel and unusual punishment. If you ask the average prisoner a choice, you can spend 5 years in prison or 50 lashes. Yeah, Bill? I'm not asking you the question, but just think about that for a minute. How much?
If you have wife and kids, you probably take lashes.
You take the lashes. Okay. Did you have a question, sir?
Yeah, so you said that the world is
substantive, yes.
Yeah, due process. Yeah, you said it's not much about law anymore. So what is it? It's philosophy?
Maybe. Yeah, it's the values that the judges draw on. This comes from a lot of different places. But once you leave the realm of the Bill of Rights and the clause of the Constitution, you're in a different world.
Value, morality, it's philosophy. It's wrong to say that our judges are unbiased. We shouldn't say that because it's just not true.
I don't say that. Yeah. But I don't like the word bias because it has a negative connotation. I think judges are appointed for a certain philosophical reason, that they have certain beliefs. I think it's why they're put on the bench. Yes, 1 and 2.
Is this still this law?
Yep.
So we still, we would have the right to still not deliberate?
Well, so there's a note about this in the reading. Roe v. Wade, which was the big abortion decision, Justice Blackmun favorably cites Buck v. Bell. And he cites it for this reason. He says, the woman says that she has an unlimited right to do with her body she pleases. He says, no. Women do not have the unlimited right because Carrie Buck.
But even with this reasoning that we now know it's wrong?
It's so good. There's a thing in your book, the 8th Circuit cited about 15 years ago in the case of prisoners who decide to either let them out or sterilize them. So it's still not been overturned. It hasn't. One note, just that I'll mention this in passing. My ConLaw professor, Ron Rotunda, who taught me that bit at Blackman, he passed away this week. He was a great guy. He taught at Illinois, at George Mason, Chapman. He was a very good professor. I owe him a lot. And he taught me that fact years ago, and I'm giving it to you. So I'm continuing on this legacy of feeble-mindedness, I suppose. Yeah, I saw Brian was a hand up? And then Chase.
Where do you draw the line? But hasn't, in more modern times, rights that are enumerated within the first 8 amendments of the Bill of Rights or found to be protected under the Due Process Clause is essentially where do we draw the line today? How does the court in Buck make this determination when years prior in the Meyer case, they essentially the grounds laid out these rights.
The right to raise a family, huh? That's not one of them.
Exactly.
Yep.
So how is it that this particular person does not have that right and everyone else does? Like, how do you support that?
Hashtag science. No, I think the answer. I think the answer, and you raise a very good question. I think the answer has to be, they felt the interest was compelling enough, right? That even though that the means, there was a deprivation of liberty, that this eugenic vision was so significant that it justified this arbitrary deprivation of freedom. I think that's how you have to read it. I don't know. Do you have a better answer? I don't have a good answer for you. It's often a tough thing. How do you reconcile opinion A and opinion B? Decided a couple of years apart, and sometimes there's not a very good answer. I don't mean to dodge your question. Yes, Regina.
Personal liberty, but I feel, in my opinion, that the opinion itself actually addressed society's liberties because he mentioned that, it's better for us to sterilize them and end this process now rather than for us to, kill them when they commit criminal acts or because of them being imbeciles they starve. So I think they were thinking of the imbeciles as a burden on society, and that it would serve a greater purpose now because somebody else rather than this one person.
Yeah, Regina raises a very good point. She says that this wasn't just about Carrie Buck, it was about the bigger picture, right? That we either sterilize these people now, or we throw their kids in prison later, right? Or their kids starving on the street, right? That's a significant state interest, the end that they're trying to accomplish. So that perhaps, even though it's a gross invasion of Carrie Buck's liberty interest, it's justified to stop this. Oh, Chase, I skipped over before, I'm sorry. And then Kevin.
So, and this is not come from me personally, but clearly when it comes to right and wrong, that can kind of be subjective based on the time period. So is the reason that it's probably still good law today, does that have to do with the fact that when you look at it from almost a numerical standpoint, if you sterilize someone, you're taking away that one right, but then like you said, they're back in the world, they can live their life, everything else like that. But if you keep them in prison, that's taking away almost all of their rights.
It's a far greater, it's a far greater, this was my question to you at the beginning, right? Which is a greater infringement on liberty? And a third of you, almost 70% of you said that the sterilization is greater than the draft. Let me ask the question differently, right? Let's just try this again. Which is a greater infringement on liberty? Compulsory sterilization or life in prison? Well, we'll see if this one's different, right? That's your question. See what happens. See what the results are. I don't know. Maybe these are your options: compulsory sterilization or life in prison. Those are your options. You're Carrie Buck. Say, look, we can let you out. We'll give you a little surgery, or you can stay in a home for the rest of your life with no chance. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about the rate? What do you change it to compulsory reversible sterilization rate? So that wasn't permanent.
You could, but there's a question we want to answer. Yeah, that's why it makes it harder to answer because it can't be reversed.
If it's good as law, you should enforce sterilization on members of Congress.
Maybe only in the context of adultery, perhaps. Kevin.
So Holmes was talking about this burden on society for justifying sterilization, and then he says it's equivalent to vaccines. But I mean, vaccines stop me from dying of the plague. That has like a direct benefit to me. But I mean, what is the burden of having like individuals amongst us?
They dilute the public welfare funds. Prisons get overflowed. So this one, look at this. So it's almost the exact opposite. So in the first question, you said that the sterilization was a bigger infringement on liberty. And in the second question, you said that the life in prison, almost by the exact same number. So you guys aren't worried about dying in war, but you are worried about spending life in prison. That's fascinating. I'll change the question for next year. Actually, that's a better question. I got more what I wanted. I thought you'd be afraid of the draft, but apparently you're afraid of rotting in prison. I don't know, Brian.
So even if the state is given the option to like imprison somebody for life, that person still has no right to appeal like their imprisonment.
No, you're done. When you're committed for imbecility, you're there for life because you're always made imbecile.
So then how does the state justify?
So this is like someone, let's say someone commits a crime, this in criminal law, and they're judged to be incompetent to stand trial, right? They can't stand trial. They're committed to a home. They're there for the rest of their lives until they can justify that they have the mental competency to stand for trial. They're locked up forever.
But even years later, like
Same.
Even like 1990, when DNA evidence starts to be used.
I'm not talking about a criminal trial. If you're deemed incompetent to stand trial, you're in a home. You're in a mental institution for the rest of your life. Well, if you're competent, then you stand trial and you can go to jail afterwards. But I'm saying a commitment is a civil process. It's not a criminal process. If you're mentally incompetent, you're civilly committed.
Yes, but you're only,
Guys, just one at a time, please.
You're only civilly committed until you're being mentally competent.
Yes, and they'll say Carrie Buck is an imbecile for the rest of her life. No trial. No appeal.
And even like when she's
No.
old and gray?
Nope. Nope. Damon, last question, we'll move on.
I want to ask a question regarding your previous point that we're not talking about the clauses and laws much. So, to my understanding, we're it's on the judges now to decide the means, ends, fit, and also scrutiny. Also, we had this congruence.
Similar, yeah. Similar, yeah.
Proportionality between the injury and the remedies. So, after the 10th Amendment, it was, the trend was for the judges to decide, gives more discretion to the judges to decide based on the situation of the case. Can we interpret that?
You put a lot of points in there. Let me try to synthesize them. Whenever you have a judge deciding the validity of a law, they're always going to be asking, what is the government doing and what are they trying to accomplish? Those are the means, the ends. It comes up in the Commerce Clause. It comes up in Necessary and Proper Clause. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, congruence, proportionality, due process. It's the same inquiry. The only difference is there's the word commerce, and you can figure out whether commerce means this or means that, right? There's a word appropriate legislation. Is it appropriate or not? But when you have the word liberty, think back to Lincoln, right, with the sheep and the wolves. This word liberty is not self-defining. If you're limiting yourself to the Bill of Rights, okay, there's a Bill of Rights, 8 amendments, that's liberty. But when you're saying the right to be a teacher, the right to have contraception, right, where do you get that from? Well, you say, well, the right to contract is in the Civil Rights Act of 66. Okay, what about these other things that aren't? So once you go beyond history, judges don't have the signposts. Driving on the highway, turn left for this, turn right. There are no signposts to decide what liberty means. Okay, last point, I promise. 1, 2, then we'll move on.
Sorry, this could be off base, but should we put anything into the court granting deference to states, or I guess granting deference to legislation that might affect women more opposed to men?
So ask me that question when we do Carolene products in a few more minutes. You're not off base, you're about 5 minutes early. Yeah, Stephanie, last point, then we're going to run out of time.
Could you address I was disturbed to find out that there was not a written dissent in this case.
Oh, good question. Yeah. So I referenced this, and I've done a lot of research on this. Justice Butler dissented without an opinion. And Buck v. Bell is unique because almost every case you read that's really egregious has a dissent, right? Harlan in the Plessy case, or Harlan civil rights. Yeah, in the Korematsu, you had Justice Jackson, right, and Justice Murphy writing very vigorous dissents. Buck v. Bell stands alone, as far as I can tell, as one of these anti-canon cases without a dissent. And that makes a difference, because when there's a dissent that makes a good point, the majority might respond to it, or they might soften their claim a bit. But this was Holmes all the way. And I did some research on this. As a note, Butler didn't write a dissent, which was a common practice. And it was often thought that Butler, who was the Catholic, there was a Jewish seat and there was a Catholic seat. That's how it worked, right? Butler had the Jewish seat, dissented because of his, he had the Catholic seat. He dissented because of his Catholic faith, which was very much opposed to sterilization and eugenics. To this day it is. There's no evidence that was true, right? I can't find it that he ever did it. He just didn't write a dissent. Holmes apparently made fun of him for that purpose, but there's no evidence that was actually true. So short answer is there's no dissent, which is why the case is even more egregious. You don't have the benefit of saying another opinion, right? You don't know at the time who was. There are state Supreme Court opinions, I mentioned, that come out the other way. Those might be useful to study, but at the Supreme Court there was only one opinion. That was Holmes.
I will say that
Yeah, go ahead.
at that point, typically had he signed on to the majority, he would have been excommunicated. He would have,
Really?
Yeah, he would have been in 915 because of,
Remind us, what's Canon 915?
Canon 915 is for moral reasons. If you violate any of the church's teaching, which would include eugenics at that time, that would be excommunicatable offense. So he could not have signed on with that. And the church was far more conservative at that point than it is now in who they
So do you think that was the reason why he didn't join the opinion, or it was just his own beliefs?
It could have been a mix of both, but I would be willing to bet that the threat of excommunication might have been there.
Was there ever any thought to excommunicate Catholic judges who signed abortion opinions?
They've tried. In the modern era, bishops are so wishy-washy. You don't know what they're going to do.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Having a canon lawyer in the room is wonderful. I never heard that. If you do any research on this, please report back. But I've read into this and I can't find anything about it. But it's a fair question. All right. Let's move on. The remainder of the class goes post 36. Right. When we discussed the Commerce Clause and the taxing power, I explained how 1936 was a milestone year, where the Supreme Court largely changed directions in a lot of respects. For years, students were taught that, the turning point was a case called West Coast Hotel v. Parrish. This case considered a minimum wage law for women from Washington State. Now, we all know, last class, in Atkins versus Children's Hospital of D.C., the court invalidated a minimum wage law for women. So, isn't that the Supreme's law? I mean, the Supreme Court made its decision. Barely a decade later, the court reverses Atkins and upholds, by 5-4 vote, the Washington minimum wage law. Why is this case important? Justice Owen Roberts, who voted with the majority in Atkins, also voted with the majority in West Coast Hotel v. Parrish. This gave rise to so many things. If Justice Roberts changed his vote, right? It's just so easy, right? Different Justice Roberts. Obamacare, right? There it is. Thank you. But why did the court change his vote? So the story was long that, Roberts felt pressured by FDR, and he was afraid of this court packing scheme. That's not accurate. Roberts actually changed his vote before the court packing scheme was announced, and everyone knew that Roosevelt's plan didn't have the vote, so that part's not true. But gradually, starting in the 1930s, the court became a little bit shifting to the left. Even though President Hoover put several justices, he was a progressive. He wasn't conservative in all regards. So the court overrules Atkins. And 1936 represents a change in how the court would approach substantive due process. This was basically the burial of Lochner. Lochner's not expressly overturned, right? It's never been overruled. But what this court says is we are not going to second guess the wisdom of legislation. Here, Holmes prevailed. He was not in the court anymore. He had passed away by this point. But Holmes prevailed, right? There'll be no more Lochner. There'll be no more Atkins. What about Myers? What about Pierce? This would present the conflict for the court. How do you say there's no more substantive due process and still have Myers and Pierce? Right? This issue would not be resolved until a very famous case called United States versus Carolene Products. I've referenced this case 4 or 5 times at this point. Now I can finally talk about it. It was this case that created the modern-day framework for substantive due process in its famous footnote 4, the most famous footnote of all time. All right. Who's next? Donnie, want to give me the facts on Carolene Products, please?
So it was about I think it was Carolene Products. They were a milk. They made condensed milk, I think, and they mixed it with some kind of oil. But there was an act that prohibited the interstate commerce of skim milk, and I believe the defendants purposely drove a truck with skim milk in it across interstate.
Very good. You did the extra reading. Very good. So this is a case that I'm very intimately familiar with. First off, anyone ever have any of this? Milnot? No one ever tried? I haven't. Oh, I had a case I've given away over the years. But I'm somewhat obsessed with this case. Where is it? Yeah, so here, it's still in existence. It's condensed milk, okay? What is condensed milk? It's in a can. Why does it not spoil? Because there's a process where they remove the dairy and they replace it with vegetable oil. Originally, they used coconut oil, and they changed to vegetable oil later on. Why was this product so popular in the early 20th century? It was milk that did not require refrigeration. You take this for granted. A lot of people at the time didn't have electricity, and they couldn't keep fresh milk on the shelf. It would go bad, it would spoil, you'd get sick. So this is a very important product. So how do you think government responded to this wonderful new innovation that keeps people healthy? They banned it, of course. Why? Dairy farmers. Dairy farmers saw condensed milk as a threat. So, #science, they put all this junk report saying that filled milk was dangerous for you. And Congress banned the shipment of filled milk in interstate commerce because they said it's dangerous, it's not healthy. One of my favorite similar laws involves margarine. Everyone know what margarine is, right? It's like a butter substitute made of vegetable oil. States passed laws, this is serious, requiring that margarine must be dyed pink so people will not confuse it with butter. It was protectionist, and you have to dye your margarine bright pink so people won't think it's butter. The dairy farmers had, they had that control, right? So this law gets enacted where they ban the sale of filled milk in interstate commerce. Okay, so the Carolene Products Company was owned by a guy named Charles Hauser. I don't have a good picture of him. It's a little bit small, but that's him. I got to know Mr. Hauser through his grandchildren. I spoke with his granddaughter, Donna, and his grandson, also named Charles, at some length. I'll write that at some point of an article, but it's in your book. And he was committed. He said this is a healthy product, and he wanted to sell it. So his case went to the Supreme Court twice. Went up in the first time, and he challenged it under the Commerce Clause. He said, well, shipping milk is not interstate commerce. That argument would not go far because by 1938, the court had already ruled in Darby that commerce means everything, right? Everything's commerce. That's not why I'm assigning you this case here, right? The actual Commerce Clause analysis of this case is not very important. What's important is the footnote 4, right? The fourth footnote. By the way, if you want, I have very old recipe books in the 1930s from Carolene Products. These are very old. 1937, this one's 19, I don't know what year this is, but they're very old. I have an eBay alert. I have a bunch of these. I give them away. They make for good presents. But I'll show you these later. So this case goes to the Supreme Court. And even though this is a Commerce Clause case, the Justice Stone puts together this famous footnote 4. And I want to walk you through this very carefully. What Justice Stone was trying to do in footnote 4 was to create a framework for judicial review. He recognized we can't have Lochner anymore, but there might be some cases where you do want heightened judicial review. This was, I think, a question asked a minute ago, right? What if the law affects men and women differently, right? I told you I'd get you, I promised. So he puts together this framework, and he discusses this concept of the presumption of constitutionality. The presumption of constitutionality. And we've mentioned this before. Justice Holmes applies a very strong presumption of constitutionality. The idea is this, that when a law comes to the court, you presume that it's lawful. The fact that it went through the democratic process, was voted on, etc., you presume it was lawful. And under this presumption of constitutionality, you only invalidate the law if there's really clear evidence that this is no good. Really clear evidence, right? If there's a judgment of opinions, Joe thinks this and Bill thinks that, okay, we'll disagree. Who am I, the judge, to second guess the legislature? So the footnote 4 of Carolene Products answers the question of when do you apply a presumption of constitutionality and when do you not apply it? Or to use the framework of my colleague Randy Barnett, when are you applying a presumption of constitutionality? Or when are you applying a presumption of liberty? They're mirror images of each other, two sides of the same coin. So there are three major premises in footnote 4, three major ideas. And the first one says, there may be a narrower, I can never say that word, a more narrow scope for operation of the presumption of constitutionality when legislation appears on its face to be within a specific prohibition of the Constitution, such as those in the first 10 amendments, which are deemed equally specific when held to be embraced within the 14th. So he's making two important points here. When legislation runs into a provision of the Bill of Rights, something that limits free speech, for example, or the free exercise of religion, or one might say the right to bear arms, there's a more narrow scope for operation of the presumption of constitutionality. Why he framed it so convolutedly, I couldn't tell you. What he's saying is you apply a presumption of liberty, right? You don't give the normal presumption of constitutionality when you're affecting the Bill of Rights. You give what you call a presumption of liberty. Okay? Why? Because it's written in the Constitution. Judges don't have to make crap up, right? There's not much of a risk of enforcing free speech because it's in the damn Constitution. This is not judges digging into Civil Rights Act of 1866 and talking about philosophy. It says it, make the law abridging freedom of speech. So courts are on a good basis to apply a presumption of liberty when dealing with the Bill of Rights. Okay? But what's the flip side of that? What if a right is not enumerated? What if we are talking about a liberty interest under the 14th Amendment? The right to earn a living, the right to teach, right? The right not to get sterilized. Aha. For those unenumerated rights, you apply the presumption of constitutionality. So he's saying two things. You don't apply the presumption of constitutionality when something's on the Bill of Rights, but you do apply it when it's unenumerated, not listed in the Bill of Rights. This is digging Lochner to a grave, right? This is saying courts can no longer recognize as thin air rights to contract. No more Lochner. No more Lochner. That's what that first paragraph is doing. If there's a case involving free speech, give it some scrutiny, right? Give it a presumption of liberty. But if it's a court applying, making up rights of contract, not written down, you can't look at it very closely. Everyone get that first paragraph. This is a very important point people often forget. That it treats unenumerated rights as second-class rights. If a right is not enumerated, it doesn't get the same treatment. If you turn briefly, I'll mention this very briefly, the Ninth Amendment. Which I will not probably read it again this semester, but I'll do it now. Oh no, one more time, I'll read it. But the Ninth Amendment says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. So again, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. Footnote 4 splits rights in half. If the right is written down, it gets very strong protection by the courts. If it's not written down, it doesn't get protection by the courts. And my colleague Raina Burnett thinks that the footnote 4 is inconsistent with the Ninth Amendment because it says you can't treat rights differently because they're not written down. They don't really talk about that here. Okay. Any questions in the first part of footnote 4? There are 3 parts. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is not a blanket rule, though. He says there are exceptions. It is unnecessary to consider now whether legislation which restricts those political processes which can ordinarily be expected to bring about repeal of undesirable legislation is to be subjected to more exacting judicial scrutiny under the general prohibitions of the 14th Amendment. What's he saying? Well, as a general matter, we can trust legislatures to repeal bad laws. What if you have a law that restricts the political process, right? A law that deprives people of the right to vote. A law that draws districts in such a way that representation is diluted. When a law affects the political process, maybe you give it more exacting judicial scrutiny. What does this mean, more exacting judicial scrutiny? You relax the presumption of constitutionality, right? You go more towards liberty. You give a little bit more judicial oomph to determine, well, the fact is these people can't vote to change the law, so the courts need to step in to fix it. This became known as representation reinforcement. That if people aren't given representation in the legislature, the courts can reinforce their rights when the political process breaks down. Danny?
What was that called again?
Representation reinforcement. There's a reading in your book by John Hart Ely. Did I sign it? I don't know if I signed it. It's right after the case by John Hart Ely. He wrote a famous book called Democracy and Distrust. Democracy and Distrust, where he talks about an entire theory of constitutional law based on footnote 4. This footnote spawned an entire theory of constitutional law. The courts reinforced rights where the political process broke down. And we'll get the second part, footnote 4. Yeah, beginning.
Sorry, what was that term you used?
Representation. Yeah, all right. No, you're okay. Representation, reinforcement. That the courts reinforce representation in the legislative process.
Thank you.
My pleasure. The third aspect of footnote 4 is the one most people talk about. No one really talks about the first one. Talk about the second one sometime. The third one gets most attention. He says, nor need we inquire whether similar considerations enter into the review of statutes directed at particular religious. Here it is. Pierce v. Sisters. Or national. Meyer v. Nebraska. Or racial minorities. Whether prejudice against discrete and insular minorities may be a special condition, which tends to curtail the operation of those political processes. So what he's trying to say is, look, we're killing Lochner, but we're keeping Meyer and Pierce. Right? Lochner's no good. You can't have liberty of contract. But if you have discrimination against religious or nationalist groups, that's allowed. Wait a minute. Those were not First Amendment cases. I told you that 15 times. They were Lochner substantive due process cases. Justice McReynolds said that long list was not based on something in the Bill of Rights. So this is what you call historical revisionism, right? You're trying to change history. And the court can do that. They're allowed to. They can do whatever they want. We can call them on it, but they can do it. So if there's religious or national discrimination, courts can be more heavily scrutinizing it. And this famous clause is discrete and insular minorities. What does that mean? It refers to groups that can't access the political channels. right? This is not just about racial and ethnic minorities. It is that. But the idea of discrete and insular means that they can't go to the political process in the same way that other people could. He was obviously thinking about Jim Crow. This was on the minds of people years later. So the general rule, footnote 4, is courts apply a presumption of constitutionality unless one of these three boxes is checked, right? You apply the presumption of constitutionality unless you have something in the Bill of Rights, number 1, the political process is being destroyed, number 2, or the law is affecting the discrete and insular minorities. Easy enough to say, right? 1 second, David. Easy enough to say. Is this a holding? No. It's a footnote and a dictum discussing what maybe might happen. And there are only 4 votes for it. Justice Scalia calls people who like this the dictimizers. It's a great phrase, the dictimizers. The courts never fully embraced this theory, although they've relied on it at one point or another. So it's a theory of constitutional law. It doesn't provide a clear rule of decision. Damon?
You just said that we cannot cite this.
You can cite it, right? You're absolutely welcome to cite it.
Okay. My question, if travel ban can be related to this third paragraph of this footnote, because there is if we consider the right to travel, or at least like have families, relatives come over and visit them, for certain people that within those countries, because of the religion, nationality, and they fall in the insular minorities. Does this footnote help the travel ban case?
So I'll answer your question briefly, but I'll talk to you more off the class about the details. With the travel ban, it's unclear if people outside the United States benefit from rights in the same way we Americans would. But the broader point is, this is not a rule, right? It's not the law that if something affects minorities, it's unconstitutional. It just merely means you apply a greater standard of judicial review. But that's the short answer, okay? But this was an important footnote because it informed how do you kill Lochner, but keep Meyer and Pierce? And this one split the baby, so to speak, poor choice of words. But this one figured a way of keeping both of them. But what's important, though, is Brian made this point a few minutes earlier. What happens to certain other rights? Abortion, contraception. Where do they fit into footnote 4? And the short answer is they don't. So for whatever value footnote 4 had, it had a good 30-year run. After the next case, they basically were saying, the next case applied footnote 4, but following Williamson v. Optical, the court went off the deep end. They ignored it. So footnote 4 had a good run with respect to rights, but it didn't last very long. So we can get the general idea. If you fit into one of these 3 boxes, you can then have a higher presumption of scrutiny, a higher scrutiny. Is that a hand?
Can you repeat those 3? You said courts apply presumption of constitutionality.
Yeah, these 3 items, right? So if you put in your notes, just these 3 numbered paragraphs will help you a little bit easier. The first one is if it's on the face of the Bill of Rights. The second one is if it restricts the political process. And the third one is if it affects religious, national, or the discrete and the insular minorities. Political process is repeated here. I was still repetitive, but it's the same thing. You're welcome. Everyone okay with that? As a footnote to the case, and this part I love, I think I'm the first person to make this one public. Hauser, the family story is he drove the milk truck across state line. That didn't happen. I found no record of it, but that's the family story. Family stories often expand. To get arrested, the Supreme Court ruled against him a second time, and then Franklin Roosevelt pardoned him, which people don't know about. Fascinating story. Gets even better. After Roosevelt gave him the pardon, he built a factory on the Oklahoma-Missouri state line. I love this story. And he put a brass rail down the middle. And the workers knew that once you had to fill milk, you could not cross that brass line. They had loading doors on both sides, so he would never ship in interstate commerce. The best part is he did this for decades. And finally, in 1972, a court struck down the Filled Milk Act. The government didn't even appeal. I think I was the first one to figure that one out also because Randy didn't even know about it. But one of House's grandkids said, "Oh yeah, the court ruled in favor of my." I was like, "No, he didn't." I was like, "No, the court did it." So I reasoned, like, "Oh, it did. It ruled in favor." I couldn't believe it. It was amazing. Okay, fascinating case. We'll talk about this case for hours. Anything else on Carolene products? All right. The last case for today I want to talk about is Williamson versus Lee Optical, and we've given you not just the Supreme Court opinion, but also the Court of Appeals opinion. And the reason why is just to show you that there are two different ways to apply footnote 4. And there's two different ways to apply these sorts of scrutiny of economic regulations. So I'm going to summarize here because I'm short on time. What was that issue? Lee Optical was like lens crafters, right? You can go in and they'll make you a pair of glasses in a fairly short period of time. Who didn't like this law? Eye doctors, right? Because it creates competition. Back then, the only way to get a pair of glasses was to go to an eye doctor, and then you have to pay for a visit. Now, for a lot of people, if their prescriptions don't change, you don't need to go to an eye doctor, right? Let's go back up yet. We're not done. Yeah, 5 minutes. I'll thank you. So with most people, they want to get a pair of new glasses, so they'll get a checkup. Oklahoma passes a law that says optometrists, right, that is people who are not medical doctors, can't fit lenses. They can't put a lens into a frame. Only an ophthalmologist as a licensed doctor can do this. So a lawsuit was brought challenging the constitutionality of this statute. The district court, at the time it was a 3-judge panel, ruled against the optician, saying that the state they ruled against the state. They said that there's no meaningful relationship between fitting lenses and safety, right? You're literally, think about it, you're taking a piece of glass, you're shaving it into a specific shape, and you're putting it into a frame, right? There's no medical necessity to be an eye doctor to put a piece of glass into a frame. So what the lower court did was they said, well, there's not a rational basis to justify this. The district court doesn't quite go as far as Lochner, because they admit that there is a public interest in safety. But this law is about protectionism, right? It's about protecting eye doctors, and the court rules is unconstitutional. But then it gets appealed to the Supreme Court. And Williamson v. Optical is a very important case in that it goes beyond Carolene products. What we have here is this right of contract. The argument is the 14th Amendment protects a right of contract. Okay? It's not enumerated. So under Carolene products, footnote 4, if you have an unenumerated right, you apply the presumption of constitutionality. But that presumption can be rebutted, right? The mere fact that you apply a presumption of constitutionality does not mean the government always wins. Right? It does not mean the government always wins. The government can lose with the presumption of constitutionality. How? You show this law has no rational basis, right? It's silly. You don't need a medical degree to put a piece of glass in a frame. There's no reason why you have to have it. But Lee Optical changes the standard. Lee Optical introduces a new standard, right? What we often call a rational basis review, a very specific kind. The idea is, it doesn't matter what the government's actual reasons are for doing this. Courts are enabled to make up reasons why the government could do this. So imagine this, right? You guys are lawyers. You file a lawsuit against the government. You say, this glasses law is insane. And the government comes back and says, we have 3 reasons why we enact this law, 1, 2, and 3. And then you reply and you're saying, no, those reasons are no good. Okay, you put your brief in. Now, a couple months later, you get a decision from a court. And the court says, you know what, we agree reasons 1, 2, and 3 are not very good, but here's reasons 4, 5, and 6 we made up. And by the way, you don't get to reply to the court. You lose. You wouldn't like that very much. That is what means to have rational basis review, where the court can make up why the legislature might have enacted this law, right? The court says the legislature might have concluded that you need to go to a doctor to see if you have any sort of eye disease. That wasn't the actual reason, but it was a made-up reason. What Williamson v. Optical did was expanded this presumption of constitutionality to make it impossible for economic challenges to prevail. Impossible. Right? Carolene Products buried Lochner. Williamson v. Optical hit it with a shovel and killed it. Right? Even after Carolene Products, Lochner still had some teeth. It still had some weight because you could rebut this presumption of constitutionality. But once you get to Williamson versus Lee Optical, it can't be rebutted. If you're litigating, imagine if you're litigating, you're a lawyer, and no matter what arguments you put forward, the court can make up a third, a fifth, and a sixth argument, you're going to lose every time. This made it impossible to challenge economic regulations. The Lochner era was killed in 1955 with Williamson v. Lee Optical. And then a couple years later in Griswold v. Connecticut, where they struck down a law banning contraception, they brought it back to life. So the Lochner era was not gone for very long. But the difference, this is my bridge for your next class, the court maintained footnote 4's split. Economic rights were treated as second-class rights, but rights the court deemed fundamental. Fundamental rights were given heightened scrutiny. And this was a new framework put forward. If a law could be fit into what the court deemed important or fundamental, it was given heightened scrutiny. Otherwise, it's given the mere presumption of constitutionality, and it is upheld. So today's class is a inflection point. We stop at Williamson v. Lee Optical, no scrutiny. Next class, we do Griswold and other cases, and they apply a very strict scrutiny to fundamental laws affecting reproduction. Go see the Scalia thing at 1. Thank you all so much. I'll talk to you later.